Irene's life had always been built on small certainties: a modest apartment above a bakery that smelled of sugar at dawn, a husband she believed in too easily, and a future she assumed would unfold in predictable lines until the night she came home early and found those lines violently erased, her husband tangled with another woman in the living room as if the home she had maintained was already someone else's property, and in the stunned silence that followed her departure into the rain she did not cry at first but simply walked, step after step, until the city blurred into cold light and exhaustion, and it was there, outside a closed riverside hotel, that a black car stopped beside her and a man she did not know stepped out. Sebastian Hale, a billionaire whose name circulated in financial headlines and whispered scandals, a man known for erratic desires and a restless, consuming addiction to intimacy that the press never fully named but hinted at with cruel fascination, and instead of passing her by like everyone else, he studied her soaked figure and asked not who she was but where she was going, and when she answered nothing he opened the car door as if it were the most natural thing in the world, setting into motion a collision between two broken trajectories. Sebastian did not offer kindness in the way she expected, not soft words or pity, but structure, distance, and an almost clinical clarity as he brought her to a private estate outside the city, a place of glass walls and silent corridors where every object seemed curated to avoid emotional chaos, and there he made her an offer that should have sounded insulting but instead felt like stability after collapse: a contract marriage, a fixed-term arrangement that would give her security, protection, and financial independence, while giving him the social stability he required to manage his public image and personal volatility. And Irene, still raw from betrayal, agreed not because she understood him but because she understood what it meant to have nothing. The contract was precise, almost unsettlingly so, defining separate rooms, limited public appearances, and boundaries Sebastian insisted on more strictly than she did, as if he feared himself more than he feared her rejection, and in the first days she lived like a guest in a museum, observing him from a distance as he left early, returned late, sometimes pacing the corridors at night as though wrestling invisible storms, his addiction to physical connection manifesting not in pursuit of her but in a controlled restraint that made him appear more dangerous in his discipline than in indulgence. And then there was Bella, his daughter, a quiet child with wide observant eyes who had not spoken to any stranger since the loss of her mother years earlier, a child who moved through the estate like a shadow refusing to be caught, until one afternoon Irene found her sitting under a magnolia tree trying to fix a broken music box with trembling concentration, and instead of speaking Irene simply knelt beside her and held the scattered pieces without forcing words, and something in that silence did not demand performance or expectation, and Bella did not speak but she did not leave either. Days passed and small repetitions became rituals: Irene leaving a cup of warm milk outside Bella's door, Bella slowly accepting it, Bella watching Irene from stair landings, Irene learning that Sebastian's wealth had built walls around his daughter not out of neglect but fear that every connection would break like the last one had, and Sebastian himself watching all of this from behind glass reflections, noticing for the first time that Bella's withdrawal softened only when Irene was near, which unsettled him more than any business crisis ever had. He confronted Irene one evening in the library where rain tapped against the windows like distant code, asking her what she wanted from him, expecting either greed or manipulation, but she answered simply that she wanted nothing beyond the agreement they had signed, and that honesty, so blunt and unadorned, irritated him in a way desire never had, because it made his usual assumptions useless. And in the weeks that followed the estate shifted in ways no contract could predict. Bella began to sit closer to Irene without speaking, sometimes placing toys beside her instead of across the room. Sebastian reduced his late-night absences and replaced them with restless presence in shared spaces, and Irene, who had once believed love was a transaction disguised as devotion, began to notice the fractures in Sebastian's control, the way he avoided mirrors after certain calls, the way he held himself rigid when Bella laughed silently at Irene's clumsy attempts to braid her hair. Then came the first rupture from the outside world when Irene's ex-husband resurfaced, not with apology but with calculated ambition, attempting to reclaim her presence not out of love but because Sebastian's name now clung to her like currency, and he arrived at the estate under the guise of reconciliation, only to be stopped at the gates, escalating into a legal threat that dragged Sebastian into public scrutiny, exposing rumors about his condition, his unstable desires, and the contractual nature of the marriage that tabloids twisted into scandal. And for the first time Irene saw Sebastian not as a rescuer but as a man under siege, standing in a boardroom where executives questioned his judgment while cameras outside hunted for collapse. During this storm Bella stopped speaking to Irene altogether, retreating into silence more absolute than before, and Irene realized too late that the child had begun associating love with instability again, linking every adult presence with impending loss, and in response Irene did something she had never done in her own marriage: she made a choice without being asked. stepping into the legal battle not as Sebastian's asset but as a witness, confronting her ex-husband in a public hearing where she described not only betrayal but the emotional erosion that had preceded it, refusing melodrama and instead presenting plain truth with such precision that even Sebastian, watching from the gallery, seemed momentarily unmoored. The aftermath was not triumphant but complicated, as victory in court did not repair Bella's silence, and Sebastian, shaken by the exposure of his own past treatment patterns, began therapy sessions he initially treated as another contractual obligation, only to find himself unable to maintain emotional distance when the therapist asked him to describe what Irene's presence meant in his home, a question he could not answer without contradiction. One night, a power outage swept through the estate during a violent storm, and Bella, terrified by darkness, ran not to Sebastian but to Irene's room, clinging to her sleeve without speaking, and in that moment Sebastian arrived in the dim corridor expecting panic but instead witnessed his daughter's body slowly stop shaking as Irene guided her to sit, breathing with her rather than speaking at her, and Sebastian, for the first time, did not intervene, did not correct, did not control. Afterward, he confronted Irene not with authority but exhaustion, admitting that everything he built was designed to prevent dependence and had instead produced it in its most fragile form in his daughter, and Irene, instead of comforting him, challenged him to stop treating connection as either risk or transaction, a statement that unsettled him because it removed all familiar frameworks. Over time the contract began to dissolve without formal announcement, replaced by routines that were no longer negotiated but lived, Bella beginning to whisper single words again not in response to pressure but curiosity, Sebastian cancelling business trips without justification, and Irene discovering that her own sense of identity no longer hinged on survival but participation. The final turning point came when Sebastian's condition, his compulsive drive for emotional and physical intensity, spiked under stress from a corporate takeover attempt orchestrated by rivals exploiting his public vulnerability, and instead of retreating into isolation he made an uncharacteristic decision. He left the estate not to escape but to face the confrontation publicly alongside Irene, acknowledging in front of shareholders that his stability was no longer self-contained but relational, dependent on structure he did not fully control, and that admission cost him leverage but dismantled the narrative of instability that had haunted him. In the aftermath, when the estate finally quieted and the legal storms receded, Irene stood in the garden at dawn watching Bella chase light between trees, hearing her laughter in fragments that no longer felt fragile, and Sebastian joined her without ceremony, no longer maintaining distance as doctrine, and what followed was not a sudden declaration but a gradual redefinition of what their arrangement had become, no longer contract or rescue but shared construction of something neither of them could have authored alone. And when Bella finally spoke her first full sentence in years it was not to announce healing but to ask if they could all eat breakfast together outside, a simple request that collapsed every remaining barrier more effectively than any legal document or confession, leaving only the quiet recognition that what began as survival had become choice, and choice, unlike contracts or rescues, could not be undone by fear alone. The morning after Bella's quiet request for breakfast outside, the estate felt different in a way none of them immediately acknowledged, not because anything visible had changed but because the rhythm of avoidance that once filled every corridor had been replaced by small, deliberate proximity, as if the house itself was learning a new language through repetition of ordinary acts, and Sebastian found himself standing in the kitchen longer than necessary watching Irene slice fruit with a calm precision that no longer looked like survival but intention, while Bella sat at the table swinging her feet in a steady rhythm, occasionally glancing between them as though testing whether this fragile equilibrium would break if observed too closely. And when Irene finally placed plates down without asking permission or confirming schedules, Sebastian realized that no one in the room was waiting to be dismissed. Later that day, however, the outside world forced itself back in with surgical force as Sebastian's legal team arrived unannounced, faces tight with urgency, bringing news that the rival conglomerate Viral Industries had accelerated their takeover strategy, exploiting not only Sebastian's market position but the public record of his past instability and the controversial nature of the contract marriage, and buried within the briefing was something more dangerous than financial aggression, a leaked document suggesting custody vulnerability regarding Bella, constructed carefully enough to appear legitimate if taken out of context, and for the first time in months Sebastian's restraint fractured, not in action but in stillness, a rigid silence that filled the room until Bella, sensing the shift, stopped eating and placed her fork down as if silence itself had weight. Irene, noticing the subtle collapse in atmosphere, asked to see the document, and when she read it she did not react with outrage or fear but with a cold clarity that unsettled the attorneys more than any emotional outburst could have, because she immediately identified inconsistencies in the claims and asked specific questions about timing, source verification, and jurisdictional framing. forcing the room into sharper focus, and Sebastian watched her not as someone he had rescued but as someone actively dismantling a threat he had not yet fully processed. That evening, instead of retreating to separate spaces, the three of them remained in the same room while rain pressed against the glass like a constant reminder of pressure outside their control, and Bella, unusually restless, moved closer to Irene's side without prompting, pressing her shoulder lightly against Irene's arm as if anchoring herself there, and Sebastian, observing this, made a decision that surprised even him. He disclosed everything he had previously withheld about the extent of Viral's influence, including the uncomfortable truth that their attack was not only financial but psychological, designed to isolate. Sebastian remained in the study longer than usual. Not because of crisis, but because of recognition. Sebastian spoke first. We stopped defining the system because we thought definition would make it rigid. Irene replied, and now we're realizing lack of definition doesn't always mean freedom. Sometimes it just shifts the burden. He nodded slightly. To the people inside it. That sentence did not feel like accusation. It felt like accuracy. For the first time in a long while, they were not discussing survival, or adaptation, or external interpretation. They were discussing structure itself, not as theory, but as lived consequence. Days passed differently afterward. Not worse. Not better. Just more conscious. Bella began asking fewer abstract questions, but more practical ones about boundaries, timing, space, permission. Not because she was distressed, but because she was mapping the invisible structure she had previously lived inside intuitively. Sebastian started responding to those questions with more explicit clarity than before, sometimes even over-explaining, correcting his earlier tendency toward implicit understanding. Irene noticed something important in this shift. They were rebuilding definition not to return to rigidity, but to prevent drift. And then came the second disruption. It did not arrive as conflict or external pressure. It arrived as absence. Sebastian was invited again, this time not to a forum or consortium, but to a closed institutional review on governance ethics, where his model had been cited in unrelated policy debates. The invitation was minimal, formal, almost procedural. He did not refuse. He did not accept immediately either. But the existence of it reintroduced something they had not felt in a long time: external pull. Irene saw the change before he spoke about it. You're thinking about going. I'm thinking about whether absence is still part of who I am, he replied. That answer concerned her more than a refusal would have. Because it meant he was again evaluating identity through participation. That evening, Bella asked a question that cut through both their silence without intention. Are you leaving again? She asked it calmly, not in fear, but in calibration. Sebastian knelt slightly so he was at her level. No. But I might go somewhere for a short time. She studied him. Like before? No, he said. Then corrected himself. Not like before. That distinction mattered more than certainty. Irene added, and we will always tell you before anything changes. Bella nodded, but did not immediately relax. Instead she said something new, something that revealed how far she had moved beyond earlier dependency patterns. Can you come back exactly the same? Neither of them answered quickly. Because the honest answer was no. Sebastian finally said, no. But I will come back still here. That answer, imperfect as it was, seemed to settle something in her more effectively than reassurance would have. She accepted it not because it removed uncertainty, but because it acknowledged it. The next morning, Sebastian did not leave. Instead, he wrote a formal response declining the institutional review. No justification. No explanation. Just refusal of extraction from the space they had built. When Irene read it, she did not ask why. She simply said, that's a choice now, not avoidance. And Sebastian replied, that took longer to learn than anything else. Bella watched both of them from the doorway, eating quietly, absorbing not meaning, but consistency. And in that ordinary morning, something that had once required crisis, contracts, courts, and collapse no longer needed any of them to hold. It only needed 3 people who had finally learned the difference between structure that contains life and structure that is life, continuously lived, without needing to become anything more than what it already was. What followed that morning did not feel like closure, but like a recalibration that extended beyond language, as if the house itself had adjusted its expectations of them. Sebastian noticed it in how decisions no longer felt like turning points but like minor adjustments within an already stable system, and Irene noticed it in the absence of anticipatory tension that had once colored even ordinary conversations, while Bella experienced it simply as an increase in predictability that did not require explanation. Yet even within this renewed stability, a new and more delicate challenge began to emerge, one that none of their previous crises had fully prepared them for. The question of separation without rupture. It started subtly when Bella began asking, during casual moments, what happens when people go to different places but still belong together, a phrasing that revealed she was beginning to integrate the idea of distance as part of continuity rather than threat. Sebastian responded carefully, explaining that distance does not always mean loss, but Irene added a refinement that reflected her own lived experience more directly, saying that connection is measured not by proximity, but by whether return remains natural. Bella considered this without immediate response, then asked whether return could ever become uncertain even if people promised it, and the silence that followed was not discomfort but recognition that promises alone were not the foundation of what they had built. Around this time, Sebastian finally addressed the long-postponed institutional engagement invitation, not by accepting it in full, but by agreeing to a limited remote participation structured entirely around predefined temporal boundaries, ensuring that his absence would not dissolve into indefinite external pull. A decision that Irene supported but also scrutinized carefully, not out of distrust but because she understood how easily external legitimacy could begin to expand its demands once reintroduced. The day before his participation, Bella became unusually observant, not anxious, but attentive in a way that suggested she was tracking patterns rather than emotions, and at one point she asked Sebastian directly how long short time meant, to which he responded not with abstraction but with a specific duration, a choice Irene quietly approved because it grounded expectation in reality rather than intention. The institutional session itself, when it occurred, did not unfold as confrontation or evaluation, but as structured inquiry into adaptive governance models under relational continuity frameworks, and Sebastian found himself answering questions not as someone defending transformation, but as someone describing a system that continued to evolve without needing external validation, which subtly shifted his internal understanding of identity again, not as fixed position, but as ongoing participation in a dynamic structure that extended beyond any single environment. Upon returning, however, he noticed that Bella had interpreted his absence in a way that required gentle correction, not as fear, but as recalibration of trust thresholds, and she asked whether work would always be something that required him to leave the inside space, a phrase that Irene later reflected on as an important conceptual division emerging in Bella's thinking. Sebastian responded by acknowledging that some activities exist outside shared space, but emphasized that boundaries should always be visible, not hidden, and that uncertainty should be named rather than absorbed silently. This moment became unexpectedly significant because it marked a transition from implicit stability to explicit structure within their home, where roles, absences, and returns were no longer assumed but consciously defined. Irene supported this shift by introducing a simple but important practice. Before any external engagement, they would now explicitly map expectations together, not as control, but as clarity, so Bella would never again have to infer stability from absence alone. This practice initially felt formal, almost unnecessary, but gradually it became stabilizing in a new way, reducing the subtle cognitive load that had begun forming around ambiguity. Meanwhile, external attention towards Sebastian's earlier governance model continued to decline in intensity, not because it had lost relevance, but because it had stabilized into institutional use without requiring his presence, and for the first time he experienced something unfamiliar: influence without visibility, impact without interpretation, which removed yet another layer of identity tension he had previously carried. Yet even as external pressures faded, internal development continued, and Bella began forming her own interpretations of structure that no longer depended entirely on adult framing, sometimes explaining her understanding of belonging as people who come back even when nothing pulls them, a statement that Irene recognized as both accurate and increasingly self-derived. One evening, after an uneventful day that felt unusually full in its simplicity, Sebastian, Irene, and Bella sat together in the garden without speaking for a long time, and Sebastian realized, not as insight but as observation, that their life no longer required translation into systems, models, or narratives in order to remain coherent. Irene reached the same recognition from a different angle, understanding that what had once been a fragile reconstruction had become an active, self-maintaining structure that did not depend on external validation to persist. Bella, without articulating any of this, simply leaned against both of them and asked whether tomorrow would be normal again, and Irene answered yes, while Sebastian added, after a pause, that normal was no longer something they returned to, but something they were already inside, and in that ordinary exchange, without escalation, crisis, or resolution, their shared life continued, not as a story approaching conclusion, but as a condition that no longer required extraordinary events to justify its existence. The word normal, once spoken by Bella, did not vanish after that evening. It lingered, quietly reshaping how each of them interpreted the following days, because it forced them to confront a subtle truth: what they had built was no longer defined by instability, but it also was no longer defined by effort, and that absence of effort created its own unfamiliar tension, as if life without constant adjustment required a different kind of awareness they were still learning to recognize. Sebastian felt it first in his mornings. He no longer woke with urgency, no longer scanned for crises or obligations, yet instead of peace alone, there was a strange openness, hours that did not assign themselves meaning automatically. He began to notice small details he had never previously registered: the sound of Bella's footsteps changing as she grew more confident, the way Irene paused at doorways not from hesitation but from habit of observing before entering, the quiet continuity of routines that no longer needed to be negotiated. And for the first time, he understood that absence of pressure did not automatically create clarity. It simply revealed what had always been there. Irene experienced it differently. For her, the shift manifested as sensitivity, not anxiety, but heightened perception of imbalance that no longer had external crisis to justify it. She began noticing when silence in the house lasted too long, not because it signaled danger, but because it signaled transition. She found herself occasionally asking questions she no longer needed to ask, simply because she was learning how to exist without interpreting every pause as uncertainty. Bella, however, was the most unburdened by this new phase, and also the most precise in how she expressed it. One afternoon, she returned from school holding a small paper assignment folded unevenly in her hand. She didn't look upset. She didn't look excited either. She looked reflective, in the way children sometimes do when they encounter ideas that don't yet fit inside language they fully control. She placed the paper on the table and said, "We had to write about what makes a home." Irene glanced at Sebastian before responding gently, "What did you write?" Bella hesitated, not from confusion, but from selection. "I didn't write one answer." Then she unfolded the paper. There were 3 short lines, written in uneven but deliberate handwriting. "A home is where people notice you without needing you to explain. A home is where leaving is not forgetting. A home is where coming back is not surprising." Sebastian read it twice. Not because it was complex, but because it revealed something precise. Bella was no longer describing their life as adaptation. She was describing it as definition. Irene didn't comment immediately. She simply sat down. After a moment, Sebastian said quietly, "Did the teacher understand it?" Bella shrugged. She said it was unusual. Then she said it was thoughtful. "Do you think it is true?" Irene asked. Bella considered this carefully, as she always did now before answering questions that mattered. "It is true here," she said finally. "I don't know about everywhere." That distinction mattered more than agreement. Because it showed she was no longer universalizing her experience, nor treating it as exception. She was localizing truth, a cognitive step neither adult had explicitly taught her, but both recognized as important. That evening, after Bella went to bed, Irene and Sebastian sat together in the living room without any structured purpose. The house was quiet in the way it had become quiet lately, not empty, not tense, simply continuous. Irene broke the silence first. "She's starting to define things on her own now." Sebastian nodded. "Not repeating us. Not relying on us either," Irene added. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but measured. Sebastian finally said, "That means we're no longer the structure. We're just part of it." Irene looked at him. "Is that good or dangerous?" He thought about it longer than he used to think about such questions. "I think it means it's real," he said. The next shift came not from within the house, but from its edges. Sebastian received a final communication from the international advisory body he had once worked with, this time not an invitation, not a report, not even a request. It was a closure document. A formal acknowledgement that the Hale continuity framework had been fully integrated into multiple governance systems and was now maintained independently without further need for original authorship or consultation. It ended with a simple line, "No further input required." For a long moment, Sebastian did not move after reading it. Not because it was loss, but because it was completion without him. Irene read it afterward and said only, "So it continues." Sebastian replied, "Without me in it." Irene corrected him gently. "Without needing you in it." That distinction settled between them more deeply than any previous success or conflict. Days passed after that without reference to it. And something subtle began to happen inside Sebastian. For the first time, he stopped measuring his life in terms of continuation beyond his involvement. He began to experience existence as something that did not require his participation to justify its coherence. It was not detachment. It was release from centrality. Bella noticed the change before she could articulate it. One evening, she asked, "Do you still do important things?" Sebastian smiled faintly, not at the question, but at the assumption behind it. "I do different things now," he said. "Not things that need to stay important." She considered this. "Is that better?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "It is quieter," he said. "And quieter is easier to live inside." Bella accepted that without further question, as if it made sense in a way that did not require expansion. Later that night, as they sat together briefly before bed, routines separated them. Bella leaned her head against Irene, then shifted slightly so she was touching both adults at once. And she said something very simple, almost offhand, "Nothing feels like it might break now." Neither Sebastian nor Irene responded immediately. Because the sentence did not feel like conclusion. It felt like recognition of a condition that had finally stopped needing repair. And for the first time, no one in the room tried to improve it, explain it further, or protect it from future change. They simply remained there, inside it, without treating it as temporary. The statement Bella made, "Nothing feels like it might break now," did not fade with the night as earlier milestones had. Instead, it began to echo through the following days in a quieter, more persistent way, not as reassurance but as a kind of structural observation that each of them kept returning to in their own manner. Sebastian noticed it most sharply in contrast. He found himself, unexpectedly, waiting for fracture points that did not arrive. Not because he wanted them, but because his mind had been trained for so long to detect instability that absence of it felt almost like missing information. At first, this created a subtle internal dissonance, moments where he would pause mid-action, expecting interruption that never came. But over time, those pauses shortened, then disappeared, replaced by something unfamiliar, continuity without anticipation of collapse. Irene experienced a different effect. For her, Bella's words created reflection rather than tension. She began observing their life not as something to stabilize, but as something that had already stabilized itself through repetition and mutual adaptation. What she noticed now was not risk, but sustainability. And that realization carried a quiet emotional complexity, because it forced her to confront the idea that her role was no longer to prevent fracture, but simply to participate in continuity without overdefining it. Bella, meanwhile, moved through this phase with increasing ease, but also increasing precision in how she understood relationships. She no longer asked whether people would stay. Instead, she observed how they stayed. One afternoon after school, she asked Sebastian while unpacking her bag, "Do people always know when they are part of something permanent?" Sebastian paused before answering, because the question required him to separate permanence from certainty in a way he would not have been able to before. "No," he said finally. "I think people usually only notice permanence after it has already been happening for a long time." Bella nodded as if this matched something she had already suspected. Irene added gently, "Sometimes permanence is not a decision. It's what remains after everything unnecessary stops changing it." Bella considered that, then said, "So it's not something you choose once?" "No," Sebastian replied. "It's something you keep choosing without noticing." That answer seemed to settle in her more deeply than earlier explanations, not because it simplified anything, but because it removed the expectation of a single defining moment. And then, quietly, life began to shift again, but not toward instability. Toward independence. Bella started spending more time outside the immediate orbit of adults, not as separation, but as expansion. She began forming a small, consistent group of friends at school with whom she shared routines that were entirely separate from her home life. This did not create distance between her and Irene or Sebastian. Instead, it created layering, multiple environments of belonging that no longer competed with each other. One evening, she came home later than usual and found Sebastian sitting alone in the garden. Instead of immediately joining him, she stood at the edge of the path and observed him for a moment. Then she said, "I think I understand something now." Sebastian looked up. "What is it?" Bella walked closer, then sat beside him without hesitation. "Home doesn't stop being home when you are not inside it all the time." That sentence landed quietly, but firmly. Irene, who had been inside the house and overheard it, paused before joining them, as if acknowledging internally that Bella had crossed into an understanding neither adult had explicitly guided her toward, but both had hoped would eventually emerge. When Irene sat down, Bella continued, "It just waits differently." Sebastian glanced at Irene briefly, and in that shared look there was no surprise, only recognition that Bella had begun defining emotional structure in her own terms now, without needing translation. Later that night, after Bella had gone to sleep, Irene and Sebastian remained outside longer than usual. The air was still, but not heavy. The estate no longer felt like a constructed refuge or a repaired system. It felt like something that had grown into its own rhythm beyond correction. Irene spoke first. "She's not learning stability from us anymore." Sebastian nodded slowly. "She's extending it." That distinction mattered more than it initially sounded. Because it meant the structure they had built was no longer confined to them, it was propagating through behavior, interpretation, and lived assumption. After a pause, Irene added, "Do you think we still define it?" Sebastian looked toward the house where Bella slept, then back at the garden. "No," he said quietly. "I think we only started it." The following weeks brought no major external events. No institutional attention. No corporate reappearance of conflict. No reinterpretation cycles that demanded correction. And for the first time, that absence did not feel like waiting. It felt like settlement. Bella continued growing into her own interpretive independence, no longer framing questions around security or permanence, but around understanding variation in human behavior. Her curiosity became less about whether things would stay the same, and more about why they changed at all in other people's lives. Sebastian reduced his remaining external commitments further, not as withdrawal, but as alignment. He no longer saw external recognition as a necessary extension of internal coherence. Instead, he treated it as optional noise that could be engaged or ignored without affecting structure. Irene, in turn, no longer saw herself as mediator between instability and order. She saw herself as part of continuity that did not require active maintenance, only respectful participation. And one evening, without any particular prompting or significance, the three of them ended up sitting together in the same place where so many earlier turning points had occurred. No crisis preceded it. No decision followed it. Bella leaned slightly against Irene, then against Sebastian, not checking for reaction, not seeking reassurance, simply occupying proximity as a fact rather than a need. After a long silence, she said, almost casually, "It doesn't feel like anything is missing anymore." No one corrected her. No one expanded it. Because nothing in that moment required improvement. And for the first time in their shared history, continuity was not something they were protecting. It was simply something that was already happening, and continuing without asking permission to remain. After Bella's remark about nothing feeling missing, the silence that followed did not behave like the silences they had known earlier in their lives. It was no longer a pause waiting for interpretation, nor a fragile gap that might be filled with uncertainty. It was simply shared time, uninterrupted and unclaimed. And because of that, something subtle changed in how each of them related to the idea of next. Sebastian noticed it first in the absence of internal forecasting. He had spent much of his life long before Bella, before Irene, before any transformation, living in constant projection, anticipating outcomes, modeling consequences, preparing for divergences. But now, when he tried to do the same, the projections still formed, yet they no longer carried urgency. They appeared and dissolved without demanding action. It was as if his mind had learned, slowly and reluctantly, that not every imagined future required response. Irene noticed something different. She became aware of how often she no longer corrected small imbalances, emotional, conversational, or situational. Not because she had stopped caring, but because she had stopped assuming that imbalance was a precursor to collapse. She began allowing moments to remain slightly unresolved without feeling compelled to resolve them immediately. And surprisingly, nothing deteriorated because of it. Bella experienced the shift in the most direct way possible. She simply stopped interpreting stability as something fragile. One afternoon, she returned home with a folded paper from school and placed it on the table without explanation. Irene glanced at it but waited. Sebastian did the same. Bella did not rush them. When Irene finally unfolded it, it was a drawing, not detailed, not elaborate, but structured with deliberate clarity. 3 figures stood in a loosely connected arrangement, not touching, not separated, simply positioned within the same space. Around them, Bella had drawn faint overlapping lines that did not form enclosure, only presence. At the bottom, she had written a single sentence: people don't hold together because they are close. They hold together because they keep noticing each other. Irene read it twice before speaking. That's very precise, she said quietly. Sebastian added, and also very accurate. Bella shrugged slightly, as if unsure whether accuracy was important, then said, it's what I saw. That simple phrase, what I saw, carried more weight than explanation. It suggested that understanding was no longer being constructed through adult interpretation, but observed directly through experience. Later that week, something happened that would have once been treated as disruption, but now arrived almost quietly. Sebastian received notice of a final transition in his remaining external affiliations. The advisory frameworks he had contributed to were being expanded further into autonomous institutional systems, fully detached from any individual reference point. His name appeared in historical attribution only, not operational documentation. There was no request for input. No invitation for reflection. No expectation of response. It was complete removal of dependency. When he showed Irene, she read it without visible reaction at first. Then she said, so even your absence is no longer needed. Sebastian nodded. It seems that way. There was a pause before Irene added, that's not disappearance. That's completion of transfer. Bella, overhearing part of the conversation without full context, asked, does that mean you're done working? Sebastian considered how to answer a question that no longer fit into his old categories. I'm done being required there, he said. Not done existing there. Bella accepted this without confusion, as if she already understood the distinction. And in that moment, something important became visible to all 3 of them. External systems no longer defined Sebastian's relevance. His presence had become locally complete, independent of distant validation. But the more significant shift came not from Sebastian, but from Bella. Over the following weeks, she began making decisions without seeking implicit approval. Not large decisions, but meaningful ones. What to draw. When to speak. When to remain silent. When to sit with them and when to go alone into her own space. And she did it without checking for emotional correction afterward. This was new. Not independence as separation, but independence as continuity without supervision. Irene noticed it first, and one evening she said to Sebastian, she's no longer organizing herself around us. Sebastian responded, she's organizing herself with us included, not centered. Irene considered that, then said, that might be the first time we're no longer the reference point. Sebastian didn't disagree. Instead, he seemed almost relieved. Because something he had not been able to articulate before was becoming clear: if they were no longer the reference point, then the system they had built was no longer dependent on their interpretation of it. It was functioning beyond them. That night, as they sat together without speaking for a long time, Bella eventually leaned back slightly and said, almost absent-mindedly, I think things just keep going now. Irene replied softly, yes. Sebastian added after a moment, and we don't have to push them anymore. Bella nodded, satisfied, not because the answer explained anything, but because it matched her experience. Outside, the estate remained unchanged in structure but different in meaning. It was no longer a place recovering from instability, nor a place defending stability. It had become something simpler, and far more difficult to name, a continuity that no longer required justification to continue. What followed was not a change in direction, but a thinning of interpretation, like a layer that had once been necessary gradually becoming unnecessary, without anyone deciding to remove it. Sebastian felt it in the mornings when he no longer mentally categorized the day before it began. Irene felt it in the evenings when she stopped reviewing interactions for subtle corrections. Bella felt it in the hours between school and home when she no longer translated her experiences into questions for adults to validate. And yet, none of them named this shift aloud, because naming it would have implied it needed stabilization. Instead, they simply lived inside it. One afternoon, a small, ordinary event exposed how far things had changed. Bella came home earlier than expected and did not go to the garden or the house immediately. She stood at the entrance, looking at her shoes as if checking something internal rather than external. Irene noticed first and asked gently, "Are you okay?" Bella nodded. "I just didn't tell anyone I was coming back a different way." Sebastian, who had been reading nearby, looked up but did not intervene. Irene replied, "You don't need to report routes." Bella considered this, then said, "I know. I just remembered that I used to." That sentence carried more weight than it appeared to. It revealed that past structures still existed in memory, but no longer governed behavior. Sebastian closed the book he wasn't really reading anymore. "What changed today?" he asked. Bella thought for a moment. "Nothing. That's why I noticed." Irene exchanged a glance with Sebastian, not concern, but recognition. They were witnessing the final stage of internalization, awareness without dependency on correction. Later that week, something external brushed against them again, but faintly this time, like a system acknowledging a presence it no longer needed to engage directly. A university research group sent a brief request through formal channels, asking for permission to include long-term relational continuity environments in a comparative developmental study. The language was careful, neutral, almost respectful. Sebastian read it and did not feel intrusion. He felt distance. Irene read it and said, "They're studying something we're no longer performing." Bella asked, "What does that mean?" Sebastian answered, "It means we're not an example anymore. Just a place where something happened." Bella accepted that without further question. But later that evening, she asked something more personal. "Do you think people change back after they change like this?" The question was not about fear. It was about reversibility. Irene answered first. "Sometimes people don't go back. They just keep going forward in a way that doesn't loop." Sebastian added, "And sometimes what looks like change is actually just settling into what was already possible." Bella listened carefully, then said, "So there isn't a before version anymore?" Sebastian shook his head slightly. "There is. But it doesn't decide anything now." That answer seemed to satisfy her, not because it was definitive, but because it removed hierarchy between past and present. Days continued without disruption, but something increasingly noticeable emerged: decision-making had become lighter. Not because decisions mattered less, but because they no longer carried existential weight. Sebastian stopped treating every choice as structural impact. Irene stopped treating emotional fluctuations as indicators of deeper instability. Bella stopped treating uncertainty as something requiring adult translation. And in that reduction of weight, something unexpected appeared: attention. Pure attention, not directed at correction, but at presence. One evening, all three of them ended up in the garden without planning it. Bella was lying on the grass, watching the sky. Irene sat nearby, not monitoring anything. Sebastian stood for a while, then eventually sat too, not because there was a reason, but because there wasn't one not to. After a long silence, Bella said, "It feels like the same day keeps happening in different ways." Irene smiled slightly. "That's called routine." Sebastian corrected gently, "Not exactly. Routine is repetition. This is continuity." Bella considered this distinction. Then she said, "Continuity feels softer." No one expanded on it. Because it didn't need expansion. Later, when night had fully settled and they were preparing to go inside, Irene paused at the doorway and looked back briefly at the garden. Sebastian noticed. "What is it?" She replied, "Nothing. Just realizing I'm not checking anything anymore." He nodded. "Neither am I." Bella, already halfway inside, turned and said, "Maybe that means everything is okay now." Irene looked at her, then at Sebastian. And for once, neither of them tried to qualify the statement. Sebastian simply said, "It might mean that." Irene added, "Or it might mean we've learned not to treat okay as temporary." Bella accepted that without needing further explanation. And the house, as they entered it together, did not feel like a place holding them together anymore. It felt like a place that no longer needed to explain why they were already together. And in that quiet, unremarkable continuation, nothing concluded, because nothing required conclusion to remain complete. Time did not announce another turning point, but it did begin to behave differently around them, less like something moving forward and more like something unfolding in place, revealing new surfaces of the same lived reality without requiring rupture or renewal. Sebastian noticed this first in how memory stopped functioning as comparison. He no longer measured present moments against earlier versions of himself with the same instinctive sharpness. Instead, past events began to feel like earlier configurations of the same continuity, not better or worse, simply different arrangements of the same underlying life. This softened something in him that had long been rigid without his awareness. Irene experienced the change through attention. She found herself no longer splitting her awareness between what was happening and what it might mean later. Meaning still appeared, but it no longer arrived as obligation. It came, stayed briefly, and then left without requiring interpretation. Bella, however, moved through this phase as if it were the most natural development of all. She stopped asking whether things were stable or changing. Instead, she began asking whether things were still becoming, a phrase she used once while arranging stones in the garden without any apparent goal. That question stayed with Irene longer than expected. "Still becoming," she repeated later that evening when she and Sebastian were alone. Sebastian nodded. "That's more accurate than stable," Irene replied, "and less fragile than change." Neither of them corrected Bella's phrasing, because it captured something their own language had repeatedly failed to hold without distortion: continuity as motion without rupture. The external world, meanwhile, had largely ceased to orbit around them. Not in disappearance, but in normalization. Sebastian's earlier influence had fully diffused into institutional systems, now operating without reference to origin. Occasionally, academic or policy discussions referenced relational continuity architecture, but always as concept, not case. Their lives had become background, not erased, but no longer foreground as exceptional. This absence of attention created a new internal condition: they were no longer being interpreted. At first, Sebastian found this unsettling in ways he could not immediately articulate. Not because he missed scrutiny, but because scrutiny had once provided structure to his identity. Without it, he had to rely entirely on internal coherence, which was both freer and less externally anchored. Irene recognized this shift and one evening said, "You seem less defined lately." Sebastian considered the phrasing. "I think I'm less outlined," he corrected. "And is that good?" she asked. "I don't think it's good or bad anymore," he said. "It just is what remains when you stop needing edges to know what you are." Bella overheard part of this and asked from the next room, "If there are no edges, how do you know where you end?" Sebastian answered without hesitation this time. "You don't. You just notice what continues when you move." That answer seemed to satisfy her curiosity without limiting it. But something important was quietly developing underneath all of this. Independence was no longer an achievement they were maintaining, it was becoming a condition they no longer actively noticed. Bella began. spending entire afternoons building small, intricate systems in the garden using natural objects, stones, sticks, leaves, not as play in the traditional sense, but as arrangement. When asked what she was doing, she no longer described it in narrative terms. She said things like, "I'm seeing how things stay near each other," or "I'm checking what moves when nothing pushes it." Irene observed this without intervention. She no longer felt the need to translate Bella's experiences into developmental milestones. She simply witnessed them as expressions of an internal logic forming naturally over time. One evening, after Bella had gone to bed, Irene and Sebastian remained outside longer than usual. The air was still, but not heavy. The estate had become something closer to rhythm than place. Irene spoke first. "She's not building understanding from us anymore." Sebastian nodded. "She's building it alongside us." Irene turned slightly toward him. "That changes everything." He replied quietly, "It changes nothing that matters." She considered that. "Or it changes what matters." Sebastian didn't disagree. A long silence followed, not empty, but full in a way that no longer required conversation to complete it. Then Irene said something that had been forming in her for weeks. "I don't think we're maintaining stability anymore." Sebastian looked at her. "I think we are stability," she continued. "Not as achievement. As condition." He let that settle before responding. "That sounds permanent," he said. Irene shook her head slightly. "It doesn't feel permanent. It feels maintained without effort." Sebastian looked toward the house where Bella slept. "Then it's not permanence," he said. "It's continuity that learned how to stop asking to be justified." The next morning arrived without significance, as all mornings now did. But something subtle had changed in how they moved through it. Sebastian no longer checked for absence of disruption. Irene no longer scanned for emotional deviation. Bella no longer interpreted silence as unknown. Instead, each of them simply continued. Not in parallel. Not in alignment. But in shared presence that no longer required explanation to remain intact. And as the day unfolded in its ordinary, unremarkable way, nothing concluded, nothing escalated, and nothing resolved, because the structure they had become no longer depended on events to confirm its existence. It simply continued being what it already was, without needing to become anything else. The absence of necessity, once so unfamiliar it had felt like emptiness, eventually became something they stopped noticing at all, and in that unnoticed space, a deeper layer of their shared life began to surface, not change, not stability, but refinement without intention. Sebastian encountered it first through silence that no longer invited interpretation. Earlier in his life, silence always meant something: risk, delay, evaluation, consequence. Now it simply meant time passing without demand. And more importantly, it no longer required him to fill it with structure to make it tolerable. He found himself sitting for longer periods without purpose, not out of withdrawal, but because the impulse to convert every moment into output had softened. Even thought itself became less procedural. He would think, and then stop thinking, without needing to complete the thought into decision. Irene noticed this shift in a different way. It appeared in how she stopped monitoring emotional continuity. Where she had once tracked subtle changes in mood or relational tone almost automatically, she now allowed those variations to exist without categorization. This did not reduce her awareness, it deepened it. She began to perceive people not as states to be interpreted, but as ongoing processes that did not require immediate explanation. Bella experienced all of this as normality finally stabilizing into something she did not need to question. One afternoon, she returned from school holding nothing unusual: no papers, no announcements, no emotional weight. She simply walked into the kitchen, poured water, and said casually, "Today felt like yesterday, but not the same yesterday." Irene smiled slightly. "That sounds confusing." Bella shook her head. "It's not confusing. It just doesn't restart." Sebastian paused at that phrase. "Doesn't restart," he repeated quietly. Bella nodded as if confirming something obvious. That single observation marked something important: she no longer understood life in segments. No resets. No returns.
No resets disguised as continuity. Just flow with recognizable patterns.
And in that realization, Sebastian felt something shift again, not emotionally, but structurally. He understood that what they had built was no longer a recovery from instability, nor even a maintained equilibrium. It had become a lived system that no longer required crisis, correction, or external framing to remain coherent. But with that realization came a subtle challenge. Because systems that no longer require correction must eventually learn how to evolve without disruption. That evening, after Bella went to bed, Irene remained in the living room longer than usual.
Sebastian joined her without being asked. She spoke first. "We've stopped reacting." He nodded. "Yes." "And we've stopped correcting." "Yes." A pause. Irene continued, "More precisely now. So what changes things now?" Sebastian considered this longer than usual. "Nothing forces it," he said finally.
"So it only changes if we notice something is no longer fitting."
Irene looked at him. "And if nothing stops fitting?" Sebastian didn't answer immediately.
Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was no longer procedural. "Then nothing changes," he said. "And that becomes its own form of continuity." Irene accepted that, but not lightly.
It wasn't agreement, it was recognition of a limit.
The next day introduced no disruption, but it did introduce a subtle divergence. Bella began organizing her small garden arrangements differently. Not randomly, not emotionally, but with patterns that suggested she was testing stability itself. She would place objects, observe them over days, then slightly adjust without explanation. When Irene asked what she was doing, Bella replied, "Seeing what stays even if I don't keep it the same." That sentence lingered in both adults more than they expected.
Sebastian realized she was no longer learning stability from them.
She was testing it independently. And that meant something critical had changed. The system they had formed was no longer centered on their mutual reinforcement. It was now being extended, independently examined, internally validated by someone who had once depended on it.
That evening, Irene said quietly, "She's no longer inside what we built."
Sebastian corrected gently, "She's beyond needing it to be explained."
Irene looked at him. "That's the same thing, isn't it?" He shook his head. "No. One is separation. The other is integration without dependency." That distinction settled between them with unusual clarity. Days passed again, unmarked.
But a new behavior emerged in Bella, not emotional, not behavioral in a dramatic sense, but conceptual. She began asking fewer questions and making more statements about how things are. Not about how they should be, or how they feel, but how they function in her understanding.
One evening, she said while eating dinner, almost casually, "I think people don't really live in moments. They live in patterns that feel like moments." Irene glanced at Sebastian. Sebastian replied carefully, "That's one way to see it."
Bella shrugged.
"It's just what I notice now."
And in that moment, both adults understood something without needing to articulate it fully. Bella was no longer only receiving continuity. She was generating it. Later that night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Irene stood near the window for a long time, watching the garden. Sebastian joined her. She said softly, "Do you think we're still shaping this?" He answered after a pause. "I think we stopped shaping it a while ago." "Then what are we doing?" she asked. Sebastian looked toward the darkened rooms where Bella slept. "Living inside what it became," he said. Irene didn't respond immediately. Because for the first time, that answer didn't feel like conclusion. It felt like observation. And outside, the night continued without interruption, without demand, and without any need to become anything other than what it already was: ongoing, unmarked, and complete in its continuation rather than its ending. What followed was not a new phase, but a quiet inversion. Instead of life organizing around them, they slowly began organizing around life itself again, not through crisis or correction, but through attention returning to ordinary details that no longer felt incidental. Sebastian noticed it first in the way small decisions regained texture. Not importance, but texture. Choosing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to intervene in a conversation, when to simply
observe. These were no longer automatic or weightless.
They carried subtle differences again, not because stakes had risen, but because awareness had deepened.
Irene felt it in the return of interpretive depth.
For a time, everything had become direct, what was said was what was meant, what was done was what existed. But now, layers were returning gently.
Not confusion, but complexity.
She found herself once again considering context, history, and emotional subtext, not as threat detection, but as understanding.
Bella experienced this shift differently than both of them.
She began noticing contrast. One morning, she said while preparing for school, "Yesterday and today don't feel like the same kind of day anymore."
Irene asked, "What's different?" Bella thought for a moment. "Yesterday felt like it was just continuing. Today feels like it's deciding things again."
That sentence stayed with both adults longer than expected. Because it implied something neither had consciously initiated, the system they lived in was no longer purely continuous.
It had regained subtle inflection points. Not instability, but choice.
That evening, after Bella returned from school, she was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, but observant in a different way, as if she was tracking changes in something she hadn't yet named.
After dinner, she finally asked, "Do you ever feel like things are starting again?" Sebastian didn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer was not simple. "I think things don't restart," he said finally. "But sometimes we notice them differently again." Bella accepted this, but not fully.
There was curiosity in her silence afterward, not confusion, but active recalibration. Later, when she went to bed, Irene and Sebastian remained in the living room longer than usual.
Irene spoke first. "We're not in that quiet continuity anymore." Sebastian nodded. "No. We're back in something more layered."
"And we didn't choose that shift," she added.
He considered that. "No. It emerged when we stopped noticing that we weren't noticing things anymore."
Irene looked at him.
"So awareness cycles."
"Maybe everything does," he replied.
That realization did not destabilize them, but it clarified something important: their life had never left movement.
It had only passed through phases where movement felt unmarked.
In the following days, subtle complexity returned across all three of them. Bella began asking more precise questions again, not about stability, but about meaning in variation.
She observed that people at school acted differently depending on who was watching, and she asked whether that meant people were different or just expressing different parts of themselves. Irene, instead of simplifying these questions, began engaging with them more directly again, sometimes offering uncertainty instead of resolution. Sebastian resumed thinking in structured terms occasionally, not as compulsion, but as natural cognitive rhythm returning.
Yet none of this resembled regression. It resembled re-expansion.
One afternoon, Bella placed 3 stones in the garden again, something she had done before in earlier phases of her growth, but this time she did not leave them in fixed arrangement. She moved them slightly every day, observing how their relationships changed with each adjustment. When Irene asked what she was trying to find, Bella answered, "I'm not finding anything.
I'm watching how things stay different without breaking."
That sentence marked something neither adult immediately responded to.
Because it revealed that Bella's understanding had moved beyond stability as endpoint. She now understood stability as adaptability without collapse.
That evening, Sebastian stood alone in the garden longer than usual.
Irene joined him after a while. Neither spoke immediately. Then Irene said, "We thought continuity was something you reached." Sebastian nodded slowly. "It's something you return to from different distances." Irene looked toward the house. "And Bella is returning from her own distance now." Sebastian agreed.
Inside, Bella's light was still on, but there was no concern in that fact, only presence. And for the first time in a long stretch of their shared life, they understood something quietly but clearly: nothing had ended.
Nothing had stabilized permanently.
Nothing had fractured. Instead, what they were living inside was something far more accurate and far less final, a system that continued to evolve simply because it was still being lived, and because none of them had stopped noticing it. The recognition that nothing had settled into a final form did not bring instability, it brought attention back into sharper focus, as if their shared life had quietly regained edges that were no longer sharp enough to wound, but defined enough to notice. Sebastian felt it first in how his thoughts began to move again with direction. Not urgency, not pressure, but intentionality. He found himself planning small things, not as control mechanisms, but as ways of shaping experience with awareness again. Even choosing how to spend an afternoon had regained subtle weight, not because consequences mattered more, but because choice itself had re-entered consciousness. Irene experienced a similar return, though hers was less about structure and more about perception. She began noticing emotional shifts in others again with greater specificity, not as signals of instability, but as expressions of internal movement. Where earlier she had allowed everything to flow without categorization, she now found herself gently distinguishing nuance again, recognizing that understanding sometimes deepens when differences are acknowledged rather than dissolved. Bella was the clearest reflection of this change. She began asking questions that no longer assumed stability as a given state, but treated it as something variable and observable. One afternoon, while arranging the stones in the garden again, she asked, "If things can stay without breaking, can they also stay while changing?" Sebastian considered the question carefully. "Yes," he said. "That's usually what staying actually is." Bella nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already begun testing herself. Irene added, "Staying isn't stopping change. It's continuing through it." Bella looked at the stones, then adjusted one slightly. "Then maybe I'd been watching the wrong part," she said. That statement revealed something important. Bella was no longer interpreting stability as a condition to achieve, but as a process to observe while it occurred. Later that week, an unexpected situation occurred, not dramatic, but revealing. Bella returned from school unusually early, not due to conflict or illness, but because a scheduled activity had been cancelled. She entered the house and paused briefly in the hallway, as if uncertain what to do with unplanned time. Irene noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" Bella nodded. "They just changed the plan." Sebastian looked up from where he was sitting. "And that felt strange?" Bella hesitated. "It didn't feel bad. It just didn't feel explained." That word "explained" carried new significance. It revealed that Bella's internal expectation had subtly shifted again, from stability without definition, back toward structured understanding. That evening, Irene reflected on this aloud. "She's starting to expect reasons again." Sebastian responded, "That means she's re-entering complexity." "And that's not a step backward," Irene said. "No," he replied. "It's a step outward." Bella, meanwhile, had begun drawing again, this time not symbolic arrangements, but scenes with movement, people walking in different directions, overlapping paths, objects changing position over time. When asked about it, she said, "I'm drawing how things don't stay still even when nothing is wrong." That sentence became a quiet anchor for both adults. Because it confirmed what they were all gradually rediscovering, their life was no longer operating in a simplified continuity. It had regained dimensionality. Not crisis. Not collapse. But variation. One evening, after a long, uneventful day that still felt internally active, the three of them sat together without conversation for a long time. Eventually, Bella said, "It feels like everything is still connected, but I can see the spaces between things again." Irene smiled faintly. "That's a good way of noticing it." Sebastian added, "Spaces are what make connection visible." Bella considered this, then leaned back slightly, resting without needing alignment. Outside, the garden moved gently in the wind, unchanged, yet never identical from moment to moment. And inside, nothing demanded resolution, because nothing required simplification anymore. What they had built or become part of was no longer a fixed state of continuity. It was something more accurate and more alive, a shared existence that continued not because it had been stabilized, but because it was still capable of being experienced in new ways without losing itself in the process. As the days continued without collapsing back into either chaos or perfect stillness, something subtle but important began to emerge in all three of them, the return of contrast, not as conflict, but as differentiation.
Sebastian noticed it in how his attention no longer stayed evenly distributed.
Certain moments now drew him in more than others. A shift in Bella's tone.
A hesitation in Irene's reply. A change in the way morning light entered the kitchen. These things mattered again in a way that was neither urgent nor detached. They simply stood out.
Irene felt it through emotional layering returning to experience. Where earlier everything had felt smooth in its continuity, she now began to perceive distinctions again, between comfort and understanding, between agreement and alignment, between presence and participation.
These were not sources of tension.
They were sources of clarity.
Bella experienced it most directly, as children often do.
One afternoon she returned from school and immediately went into the garden, but instead of arranging stones or drawing lines, she simply sat and watched the wind move through the grass. After a while, she said, things feel more separate again, but not in a bad way.
Irene sat beside her. Separate how? Bella thought carefully before answering. Like I can see where one thing ends and another begins.
Before, it all felt like one big feeling. Sebastian, standing a few steps away, responded, both ways are real.
You're just noticing a different layer now. Bella accepted this without hesitation.
But later that evening, she asked something more precise than before.
If things are separate again, she said, does that mean they can get lost from each other? The question did not carry fear. It carried mapping. Irene answered first. Separation doesn't always mean loss.
It just means connection has to be noticed instead of assumed.
Sebastian added, when things are too blended, you stop seeing their relationship clearly. Separation can actually make connection more real. Bella considered this for a long time, then said quietly, so I don't have to worry when things feel less like one thing? Irene shook her head. No.
You just have to notice how they still relate. That answer seemed to settle into her understanding, but it also marked something new. Bella was now actively distinguishing relational structures on her own, without relying on adult translation as her primary framework. That night, after Bella had gone to sleep, Irene and Sebastian remained in the living room longer than usual.
The atmosphere between them was calm, but more cognitively active than before. Irene spoke first.
She's starting to understand complexity without us simplifying it for her.
Sebastian nodded.
And without needing us to resolve it for her. That changes our role again, Irene said.
Sebastian considered this carefully. Maybe not our role.
Just our function and how she learns.
Irene looked at him. And what is that function now? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, it wasn't conceptual. Witnessing, he said. Without translating too quickly.
Irene accepted that quietly. Because it described something they had been unconsciously moving toward, a relationship not based on instruction or stabilization, but on shared observation of a life unfolding in real time. In the following weeks, Bella began to show another shift, this one more internal than behavioral. She started revising her own earlier conclusions. One evening, she brought out an old drawing, the one with overlapping circles labeled stay, listen, and choose. She placed it on the table and studied it for a long time. Then she said, this was true before.
But it feels smaller now. Irene asked gently, smaller how? Bella replied, like it only shows part of what I understand now. Sebastian looked at the drawing. That's not it becoming wrong, he said. That's it becoming one piece. Of something larger. Bella nodded slowly.
So understanding grows without deleting what came before.
Yes, Irene said. It builds on it.
That seemed to satisfy her, but also deepen her curiosity further. Because now she was no longer treating understanding as something to complete, but something that accumulates without replacing itself. Later that week, an ordinary moment revealed just how far this shift had gone. The three of them were preparing dinner together, not as routine, but as shared activity without assignment. At one point, Bella accidentally knocked a spoon off the counter.
It clattered loudly on the floor.
In earlier phases of their life, such a small disruption might have triggered subtle recalibration, attention shift, emotional check, reassurance loop. But this time, nothing broke in response.
Sebastian simply picked it up. Irene glanced briefly, then continued what she was doing.
Bella watched, then said almost casually, "Nothing changed because something dropped."
Sebastian replied, "Not everything that moves changes the system." Bella nodded, absorbing it without needing elaboration.
And in that small exchange, something important became visible. Their shared life no longer treated micro-disruptions as signals. It treated them as part of continuity itself. Later that evening, as they sat briefly together before dispersing into their own quiet activities, Bella leaned back and said, "It feels like I can see more details now, but nothing feels like it's falling apart."
Irene smiled slightly. "That's usually how understanding grows." Sebastian added, "It stops simplifying and starts including more." Bella considered this, then said softly, "I think I like this version more." No one corrected her. No one needed to. Because what she was describing was no longer a fragile state they were maintaining. It was a living structure that had learned to hold both separation and connection at the same time, without needing either to dominate the other. And as the night settled over the estate once again, nothing concluded, nothing stabilized permanently, and nothing unraveled. Instead, everything simply continued, with more detail, more awareness, and more space for each of them to exist fully within the same unfolding life without needing it to become simpler than it was. The return of detail did not reverse what they had become, it refined it. Where earlier phases of their life had moved between extremes, crisis and calm, definition and openness, this new stage did something more subtle. It allowed contradiction to exist without forcing resolution, and difference to remain visible without becoming division. Sebastian felt it in how he now held multiple interpretations of the same moment without needing to choose one as correct. A conversation could be both simple and layered. A decision could be both practical and symbolic. Even silence could carry more than one meaning at once, depending on how it was approached. Irene experienced it as a restoration of nuance in human interaction. She no longer felt compelled to flatten emotional complexity into immediate clarity. Instead, she allowed uncertainty to remain active for longer, trusting that understanding did not always need to arrive instantly to be valid. Bella, however, was the one who articulated the shift most clearly. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, she said, "It feels like everything has more sides now." Irene glanced at her. "More sides?" Bella nodded. "Before, things felt like they had one main meaning. Now they feel like they have many that all happen at the same time." Sebastian replied, "That's closer to how most things actually are." Bella considered this. "So I was seeing simpler versions before." "Not wrong versions," Irene said gently. "Just earlier versions." That distinction seemed to resonate with her more than correction ever had. Over the next days, Bella began engaging with her environment differently. She no longer arranged objects in the garden, as if testing stability or continuity. Instead, she observed how arrangements changed when she was not actively maintaining them. She would leave small structures unattended and return later not to judge them, but to see what interactions had occurred in her absence. When asked why, she said, "I want to know what happens when I'm not part of the decision." That sentence marked a significant development. She was now distinguishing between presence and influence. Irene noticed this and later said to Sebastian, "She's learning systems thinking without being taught systems." Sebastian responded, "She's learning that systems exist whether or not you control them. And that changes how she sees herself inside them," Irene added. He nodded. "Less central. More embedded." The word embedded stayed with both of them. Not because it reduced importance, but because it removed hierarchy. Meanwhile, external life remained quiet, almost absent in its relevance. There were no more institutional engagements. No public reinterpretations, no external frameworks attempting to define their experience. It had all receded into background continuity. But unlike earlier phases, this absence no longer produced introspective emptiness. It produced space. One afternoon, Bella came home and found Sebastian sitting alone in the garden. She joined him without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "At school today, someone said people are either leaders or followers. Sebastian looked at her. And what did you think? Bella replied without hesitation, it didn't feel like enough categories. Irene, who had overheard from inside, stepped out and asked, why not? Bella considered carefully before answering.
Because sometimes people are both, or neither, or something else depending on where they are.
Sebastian nodded slowly. That's closer to complexity. Bella added, so maybe people aren't fixed kinds of things.
Irene smiled faintly.
They're not. That conversation did not resolve anything. It expanded nothing outwardly visible. But internally, it confirmed a deeper transition. Bella was no longer learning frameworks from them, she was generating her own from observation. That night, after Bella had gone to bed, Irene and Sebastian remained outside longer than usual, sitting in a silence that felt increasingly less like absence and more like shared processing. Irene spoke first.
She's building her own structure now.
Sebastian replied, and it's not dependent on ours anymore.
That should feel like distance, Irene said.
Sebastian shook his head slightly. It feels like continuity extending. Irene considered this. So what are we to her now? Sebastian looked toward the house. Part of the environment she learns within, he said. Not the source of it.
Irene didn't respond immediately, but her expression suggested acceptance rather than concern.
Because what they were witnessing was not detachment. It was maturation of the system itself. And in the days that followed, this became even more evident.
Bella began occasionally correcting her own earlier assumptions out loud, not defensively, but as part of natural refinement. She would say things like, I thought that was how it worked before, but now I think it's more like this, without needing approval.
Sebastian stopped interpreting her growth as extension of their influence.
Irene stopped measuring her development against external expectations. And together, they arrived, without agreement, but in parallel recognition, at the same understanding, they were no longer shaping continuity. They were living inside a continuity that now included independent growth as one of its core properties. One evening, as the three of them sat together without planning it, Bella leaned slightly back and said, almost casually, it feels like nothing is simple anymore, but nothing is confusing either.
Irene smiled. That's a good place to be. Sebastian added, it means you're seeing things as they are, not as shortcuts.
Him by destabilizing his role as a father and husband in the public eye, and as he spoke, Irene interrupted not with comfort but with strategy, proposing a public counter-narrative that reframed Bella not as vulnerability but as protected continuity, while also suggesting a temporary suspension of Sebastian's most aggressive corporate expansions to reduce exposure, a suggestion that would have been unthinkable to his board but which he considered without rejection for the first time. The following days shifted into a strange dual existence where mornings were filled with legal preparation and evenings with something resembling family life, yet beneath this fragile structure Sebastian began to experience internal turbulence he had long suppressed, not the chaotic impulses the press had once reduced him to, but a more dangerous awareness that his emotional dependency on this household was no longer theoretical, and during one late-night session with his therapist he admitted that restraint itself was no longer a shield but a pressure point, because for the first time abstaining from destructive patterns felt less like discipline and more like fear of losing what he could not name without distorting it. Meanwhile, Irene began receiving contact from her ex-husband again, this time more calculated, no longer pleading but insinuating, suggesting he possessed information about the contract marriage that could shift legal perception if shared at the right time, and though she dismissed him publicly, privately she began documenting every interaction with a meticulousness that revealed a transformation in her own behavior, from reactive survival to structured defense, a shift Sebastian noticed without her having to explain it. Bella, in contrast, began expanding her communication in unpredictable bursts, first whispering single words to Irene during meals, then repeating sounds from stories Irene read aloud, and once, unexpectedly, asking Sebastian a question. Directly, do storms come back even when they leave? A question that froze him not because of its simplicity but because it required an honesty he was not used to offering children, and after a long pause he answered that some storms return but they do not always destroy the same things twice, a response that seemed to satisfy her without fully reassuring her, which in itself felt more truthful than comfort. The turning point arrived not in boardrooms but at the edge of the estate grounds where security footage later revealed an attempted intrusion disguised as delivery personnel, part of Viral's escalating pressure campaign, and though the breach was contained before physical harm occurred, the psychological effect was immediate as Bella disappeared from the main house shortly after, her absence first noticed by Irene, who assumed she was with Sebastian, and Sebastian, who assumed she was with Irene. Until panic became mutual realization and the estate shifted into controlled chaos, what followed was not a loud search but a precise unraveling of assumptions, with Irene insisting on checking areas others dismissed, not because of intuition but because she understood patterns of avoidance in children better than the security staff did, and it was she who ultimately found Bella not far from the greenhouse, sitting beneath structural beams with her knees drawn close, completely silent, not crying but withdrawn into a stillness that was more alarming than panic, and when Irene approached she did not speak immediately, but simply sat at a distance, mirroring Bella's posture until the child's breathing stabilized, and only then did she offer a hand without insistence, waiting. Sebastian arrived moments later expecting escalation but instead found silence being used as a bridge rather than a wall, and in that moment something inside him shifted not through realization but through observation, because he saw that Irene was not comforting Bella in the way he had always associated with emotional repair but instead offering presence without demand, a method he had never learned. When Bella finally reached for Irene's hand, the movement was small but decisive, and Sebastian, instead of stepping in, remained where he was, allowing distance where he once would have imposed control. Afterward, as the three returned to the house under fading daylight, Sebastian made a choice that altered the trajectory of everything that followed. He instructed his legal team to prepare a full withdrawal from active acquisition war with Viral, not as surrender but as containment, a move that shocked his board and triggered immediate backlash. But he did not reverse it even when threatened with shareholder revolt. That night, in a quieter room than usual, Irene confronted him not with gratitude but with directness, asking whether he was making decisions from clarity or emotional dependence, and Sebastian answered without deflection that he no longer saw a meaningful distinction between the two, which for him was not confession but recalibration. In the days that followed, Bella's speech expanded in uneven but undeniable steps, sometimes forming full sentences, sometimes reverting to silence, but always returning, and Irene's presence shifted from caretaker to stabilizing force within both father and daughter's emotional patterns, while Sebastian began restructuring his life not around avoidance of impulses but understanding of triggers, a process that made him less unpredictable but more present. Yet just as stability began to take root, Irene's ex-husband made his final move, exploiting a legal ambiguity to file for emergency custody evaluation, claiming Bella's environment was psychologically compromised due to corporate volatility and unconventional guardianship structure, a filing that forced immediate court attention and threatened to pull Bella back into institutional assessment. And when the news arrived, Sebastian did not react with anger as before but with an unsettling calm, because for the first time he understood that control would not resolve this conflict. Irene, however, reacted differently, not with fear but with decisive certainty, stating that they would not present themselves as a perfect family but as an adaptive one, and that truth would need to replace image if they were to survive the scrutiny. And Bella, overhearing fragments of the conversation, quietly asked whether she would have to leave again, a question that no one answered immediately because answering it honestly required confronting the possibility that attachment itself had become legally vulnerable, and in that silence, Sebastian realized the next battle would not be fought in boardrooms or contracts but in the fragile space where language, truth, and belonging collided under judgment, and for the first time since the beginning of everything, he did not prepare to win, but to remain present regardless of outcome. The emergency custody evaluation hearing arrived with a sterility that felt almost cruel, as if the courtroom had been designed to erase human context and reduce lives to structured statements, and when Irene, Sebastian, and Bella entered, they did so under the weight of flashing media coverage that had already framed the case as a spectacle of wealth, instability, and questionable guardianship. Stripping nuance before any word was spoken, Sebastian wore no expression that could be easily interpreted, not the sharp confidence of a businessman nor the restless tension of his earlier self, but something quieter and more contained, as though he had learned to hold contradiction without letting it spill outward, while Irene walked slightly ahead of him, not as protection but as alignment, and Bella held Irene's hand with a grip that tightened each time cameras flashed. Inside, the courtroom's atmosphere sharpened further when Irene's ex-husband took the stand first, presenting himself with rehearsed restraint, carefully framing Irene's past emotional distress as instability and Sebastian's wealth as a destabilizing influence, weaving partial truths into a narrative that sounded plausible enough to trouble anyone unfamiliar with the actual rhythm of their lives, and each sentence was crafted not to attack directly but to plant doubt, like seeds designed to grow in silence. After the hearing ended, Sebastian listened without interruption, his hands resting still on the table, But Irene noticed the subtle tightening in his jaw, not from anger but from recognition. He understood manipulation now not as abstract strategy but as something that had once defined his own life. Before restraint gave him distance from it, when it was Irene's turn to testify, she did not begin with defense but with structure, describing the timeline of Bella's emotional withdrawal with clinical precision, not to dehumanize it but to make it legible, and then shifting unexpectedly into moments the court did not anticipate, small, ordinary events that revealed consistency rather than chaos. Bella's gradual return to speech, Sebastian's withdrawal from aggressive corporate behavior, the absence of coercion in their daily interactions, the absence of transactional enforcement of the original contract, and as she spoke, something unusual occurred in the room, not persuasion but recalibration, as the narrative being presented stopped fitting neatly into the categories the court expected. Still, the opposing counsel pressed harder, attempting to destabilize her by focusing on Sebastian's history of compulsive attachment patterns, framing them as ongoing risk, and for the first time Sebastian spoke without being prompted, not to defend himself but to clarify, stating that his past behavior was not absent from him but actively managed through external structure, therapy, and deliberate limitation of autonomy in specific domains, a statement that caused murmurs among observers because it reframed instability not as hidden danger but as acknowledged condition under regulation. Then came Bella's evaluation, conducted privately, and though none of the adults were present for it, what emerged later through the evaluator's report was not the absence of speech or presence of fear, but inconsistency shaped by context. Bella was expressive, curious, and emotionally responsive within her current environment, while demonstrating regression patterns when exposed to reminders of separation or institutional authority, and this distinction became the pivot of the entire case. Outside the courtroom, however, the emotional cost escalated as media pressure intensified, and Sebastian's board, already strained by his withdrawal from aggressive acquisitions, began to fracture internally, with factions arguing that his personal entanglements were now materially damaging the company's stability, and for the first time he received an ultimatum disguised as concern: step back temporarily from leadership or face forced removal. That evening, in the estate that now felt less like a fortress and more like a temporary refuge under siege, Sebastian stood alone in the study. Longer than usual, not pacing but still, while Irene found him there and did not ask what he was thinking immediately, instead placing a glass of water beside him and waiting, and when he finally spoke it was not about the company or the court but about pattern recognition, admitting that every system he had built in life, business, relationships, personal control, had been designed around preventing unpredictability, and yet the only environment in which Bella had begun to heal was one that embraced controlled unpredictability, a contradiction he could no longer resolve through logic alone. Irene responded not by agreeing or comforting but by challenging his framework directly, stating that he had confused predictability with safety, and that safety for a child was not the absence of change but the presence of reliable response within change, a distinction that landed heavily because it removed his usual tools of control as primary solutions. The next day, Bella's evaluation continued with a follow-up interaction in a supervised setting, and something unexpected occurred. Instead of retreating into silence as she had in earlier institutional contexts, she asked a question of the evaluator: why she needed to be tested when she already had people who stayed with her even when she did not speak, and that question, simple and unstructured, became more influential than any prepared testimony, because it reframed the entire premise of evaluation from risk assessment to relational continuity. Meanwhile, Irene's ex-husband escalated one final time by attempting to introduce fabricated emotional instability evidence, but during cross-examination his narrative began to unravel under precise questioning regarding timing discrepancies and lack of corroboration, revealing not only inconsistency but intent, and by the end of the hearing his credibility had eroded to the point where his statements no longer functioned as persuasive argument but as personal grievance. Still, the judge did not issue an immediate decision, instead requesting additional observation time, prolonging the uncertainty, and that waiting period became its own psychological landscape, during which Bella's progress fluctuated, sometimes speaking freely, sometimes retreating into silence after stressful reminders, and Sebastian found himself doing something unprecedented. He began adjusting his schedule not around business demands or emotional impulses but around Bella's observable regulation patterns, tracking not productivity but emotional stability windows, an act that felt to him less like control and more like learning. During one of these quieter days, Bella asked Sebastian directly whether he was going to leave again like people and stories sometimes did, and instead of offering reassurance without weight, he answered carefully that leaving was something he used to do when he did not know how to stay, but that staying was now something he practiced even when it was uncomfortable, a response that did not fully remove her fear but appeared to settle it. into something more manageable. When the court reconvened for the final decision, the atmosphere was no longer adversarial in the same sharp way, because even the legal teams had begun to recognize that the case had shifted from proving suitability to understanding sustainability, and after extensive review of testimony, behavioral evaluations, and observed interactions,
the ruling came not as dramatic declaration but as structured conclusion. Custody remained with Sebastian, with Irene
recognized as a primary co-stabilizing guardian under formalized guardianship extension, and with specific recommendations for continued psychological support and monitored adjustment rather than removal or separation. The announcement did not produce celebration so much as release of tension that had been held for too long, and Bella, instead of reacting immediately, turned to Irene and asked in a quiet voice if they could go home now, not to the courtroom's version of home but the real one they had built through repetition and presence. And when Irene nodded, Bella leaned into her side without hesitation. Outside, cameras captured fragments of their exit, but none of the images conveyed the internal shift that had occurred within Sebastian, who no longer interpreted survival as victory but as continuity. And as they left the courthouse together, he did not position himself ahead or behind but beside them, not as owner of outcome but participant in it, while Irene walked between him and Bella only briefly before Bella pulled both of their hands into her own, forming a small chain of contact that neither legal argument nor external pressure had been able to construct or destroy. And in that simple physical configuration, the most complex structure in Sebastian's life finally stopped behaving like a system under threat and began functioning like a life being lived. The first weeks after the ruling did not bring peace in any cinematic sense, but something far more subtle and demanding, continuity without adrenaline, which Sebastian found harder to adjust to than crisis, because crisis had always given him structure even when it hurt him. Whereas now the days required him to invent meaning inside repetition. The estate no longer felt like a sealed fortress, nor like a fragile refuge, but like a place in transition where every object seemed to be slowly redefined by use rather than design. And Irene noticed it most in the small failures of old routines, security briefings that no longer dominated mornings, board calls shortened to necessity rather than obsession, and Bella's presence becoming less like a cautious negotiation and more like assumed reality. Bella herself changed in uneven layers, speaking more frequently but not predictably, sometimes forming full sentences during breakfast and sometimes choosing silence during entire afternoons without distress. And what was most striking was not the fluctuation but her lack of fear around it, as if she had learned that silence was no longer disappearance but simply another state of being. Irene, meanwhile, began to experience something she had never associated with herself before: absence of emergency thinking, though it did not arrive as relief at first but as disorientation, because for years her emotional responses had been calibrated around anticipating collapse, and now that collapse did not arrive on schedule her mind kept searching for it in harmless places, misreading calm as prelude rather than destination. Sebastian observed this more than he commented on it, and instead of attempting to fix or interpret her shifts, he started adjusting his own behavior in quieter ways, such as leaving decisions open longer instead of resolving them immediately, or allowing Bella to influence daily structure in ways that would have once felt inefficient but now felt necessary. Yet beneath this emerging stability there remained unresolved tension from the external world, especially within Sebastian's corporation, where his earlier withdrawal from aggressive expansion had not been fully accepted, and a new faction within the board began pushing for his formal replacement under the argument that his personal restructuring constituted operational risk, and though he retained majority control, the pressure created a constant background friction that seeped into otherwise ordinary moments. One evening, during a rare quiet dinner outside under warm wind moving through the garden lights, Sebastian received a message that his chief financial officer had initiated a covert vote among stakeholders to challenge his leadership authority, and instead of reacting immediately he placed the phone face down and continued eating, a deliberate act that did not go unnoticed by Irene, who waited until Bella had drifted toward the edge of the garden before asking what the message was, and when he told her, she did not suggest retaliation or defense, but instead asked a question that reframed the entire situation: whether the company was still something he was building or something he was being consumed by. And Sebastian realized he did not have a clean answer because both had been true at different times and the boundary between them had never been fully defined. The next day, the estate was visited unexpectedly by one of Sebastian's senior board members, a man who had supported him during earlier years but now arrived with cautious distance, and the conversation that followed in the study was not openly hostile but layered with concern disguised as governance. with suggestions that Sebastian temporarily delegate authority to stabilize investor confidence, and while Sebastian listened without interruption, Irene stood near the window watching the exchange not as participant but as observer of power shifting shape, and Bella, sensing tension despite not understanding content, remained unusually close to Irene's side without speaking. When the board member left, Sebastian did not immediately respond to the suggestion, and instead walked through the house alone for nearly an hour, eventually stopping in the corridor outside Bella's room where he could hear faint movement inside, and instead of entering he simply stood there as if learning the sound of normal life is something he might lose. Later that night, he finally spoke to Irene not as executive or guardian but as someone attempting to articulate internal conflict, admitting that stepping away from control within the company felt like relinquishing identity he had built through discipline, while holding onto control felt increasingly incompatible with the kind of life emerging in front of him, and Irene responded not by advising but by sharing something from her own experience, that after betrayal, she had believed rebuilding meant returning to stability she once understood, but had discovered instead that rebuilding often meant accepting forms of life that no longer resembled the original blueprint, a statement that did not resolve his dilemma but reframed it into something survivable. The tension escalated 3 days later when the board officially triggered a vote of confidence procedure, forcing Sebastian into a formal confrontation he could no longer postpone, and during the preparation for it he did something unexpected. He asked Irene to attend not as symbolic support but as strategic witness, and asked Bella to stay at home not because of exclusion but protection from exposure, a distinction he explained carefully to her. And though she did not fully understand corporate mechanics, she understood separation triggers better than anyone now, and simply asked if they would both come back, to which both adults answered yes without hesitation. The board meeting itself took place in a high-rise conference room overlooking the city that had once defined Sebastian's entire world, and as arguments were presented regarding leadership stability, financial performance, and reputational risk, Sebastian did not defend himself in the ways he once would have, instead acknowledging specific points of instability while reframing them as managed transitions rather than uncontrolled decline, a rhetorical shift that unsettled several board members because it removed the binary expectation of either strength or failure. When Irene was called to speak in an advisory capacity, she did not defend Sebastian personally, nor appeal emotionally, but described patterns of behavioral stabilization observed over time, focusing on consistency of response rather than intensity of past volatility, and that testimony, stripped of sentimentality, carried unexpected weight because it aligned with observable outcomes rather than narrative framing. After hours of debate, the vote ultimately failed to reach threshold for removal, but the margin was narrow enough that Sebastian understood this was not victory but temporary equilibrium, and on the ride back to the estate he said very little, not out of defeat but calculation, while Irene sat beside him processing the realization that his world could fracture at any moment and still function as if intact. When they returned, Bella ran to meet them at the entrance without hesitation, and for the first time she did not ask if everything was okay, instead telling them she had drawn a picture of all three of them and had not erased anyone from it even once, a statement so simple it carried disproportionate emotional weight, and Sebastian, who had spent years interpreting value through systems of control and outcome, found himself unable to categorize what he felt in that moment except as something stabilizing without requiring justification. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Irene found Sebastian in the garden alone, and instead of discussing business or risk, they spoke about time, how quickly it had changed shape since Bella's arrival, how unpredictability had stopped feeling like threat and started feeling like condition, and how neither of them could return to previous versions of themselves without losing something that now felt essential. Sebastian admitted that his earlier life had been built on avoiding dependency at all costs, and that he now recognized dependency was not inherently loss of control but a form of relational structure he had never learned to trust, while Irene admitted that she no longer knew where obligation ended and attachment began, because both had evolved without clear boundaries. In the distance, Bella's light remained on longer than usual as she quietly rearranged toys in her room, humming a tune she had recently learned, and neither adult interrupted that process because it no longer felt like something fragile needing protection but something actively becoming stable through repetition. And as the night deepened, Sebastian made a decision he did not announce immediately but allowed to settle into his behavior first. He would restructure his company not around expansion or dominance, but around sustainability of presence, even if at reduced scale, because for the first time he understood that what he was building outside the estate could no longer contradict what was being built inside it, and that alignment, once formed, would either stabilize both worlds or dismantle them entirely, leaving no possibility of living split between the two again. The decision Sebastian had made did not announce itself to the world as a dramatic pivot, but it behaved like one in slow motion, because within a week the tone of his entire corporate structure began to shift in ways that only insiders initially noticed. Meetings shortened, aggressive acquisition proposals were paused rather than escalated, and departments that had once operated under constant urgency were instructed to prioritize continuity metrics that no one had previously treated as central. And while the press speculated about fatigue or strategic retreat, those closest to him understood something more precise was happening. Sebastian was no longer optimizing for expansion but for endurance. This shift immediately created internal resistance, and the board's fragile tolerance snapped into coordinated opposition, with factions forming openly rather than behind closed doors, and a second formal vote was scheduled under stricter conditions than before, this time with external auditors and shareholder representatives present, signaling that the conflict had moved beyond governance into legitimacy itself. At the estate, however, life continued in a quieter register that now felt almost defiant in its ordinariness, and Bella's progress became visible not in milestones but in continuity of behavior. She no longer retreated when footsteps entered rooms, she began initiating small conversations about objects rather than emotions, and once, unexpectedly, she corrected Sebastian's pronunciation of a word with a seriousness that made Irene quietly smile, because it marked the first time Bella had taken intellectual confidence in his presence rather than emotional dependence. Irene herself was changing in a way that was harder to describe, because she was no longer measuring her days against survival thresholds, and instead began noticing time as something that could be shaped rather than endured, though this realization also brought unease, as if she did not fully trust stability that had no immediate threat attached to it. That unease deepened when her ex-husband resurfaced in a final, unexpected way, not through legal systems this time, but through a direct message sent to her private phone containing a single sentence and an attached audio file. And though she deleted the message at first without opening it, curiosity and caution eventually pushed her to recover it, revealing a recording of a past conversation between him and a third party discussing the original intent behind his custody campaign, not as concern for Bella but as leverage against Sebastian's corporate vulnerability. And in that moment the narrative she had fought in court was not only defended but fully inverted, exposing manipulation at a scale more calculated than she had anticipated. Instead of reacting emotionally, Irene brought the evidence directly to Sebastian that evening, placing the phone on the table between them without commentary, and Sebastian listened once, then a second time, not with anger but with a narrowing focus that indicated strategic recalibration. And when he finally spoke, it was to say that this was no longer a personal dispute but a convergence of corporate and private aggression, meaning the boundaries between his life domains had finally collapsed entirely. The next day, he convened a restricted internal council at the estate rather than headquarters, a symbolic relocation that unsettled senior executives who arrived expecting formal authority and instead found a domestic environment that refused to separate business from life. And in that meeting Sebastian did something none of them expected. He announced not a defense strategy but a structural dissolution of several high-risk divisions within his conglomerate, replacing them with a consolidated framework focused on long-term governance stability, a move that triggered immediate dissent, with one board member openly stating that he was dismantling competitive advantage under emotional influence, to which Sebastian responded without raising his voice that emotional influence was not the opposite of rational governance when the goal itself had changed. Meanwhile, Bella observed fragments of this tension from a distance, sensing the altered energy in the house even if she did not understand its source, and began staying closer to Irene during the day, sometimes simply following her without speaking, as though Irene had become the axis of predictability in a world still reorganizing itself. That night, after the council dispersed in visible frustration, Irene found Sebastian in the study surrounded by documents that no longer looked like instruments of power but like fragments of an identity he was actively rewriting, and instead of speaking immediately she noticed the way he was organizing them, not by financial impact or urgency, but by emotional and relational risk exposure, a categorization system that would have been unthinkable months earlier. When she finally asked him what he was doing, he answered that he was separating systems that required volatility from those that could not tolerate it, and then added, almost as an afterthought, that he was no longer interested in being exceptional if it required fragmentation of the life they had built here, a statement that carried more implication than declaration. The second formal vote arrived with heightened intensity, and this time Sebastian chose not to frame himself as indispensable, instead presenting a long-term transition plan that included partial decentralization of authority and appointment of an interim executive. Committee, a proposal that shocked both supporters and opponents because it acknowledged impermanence of his own centrality within the company, and during the session, Irene observed from the back of the room as the emotional temperature shifted from confrontation to uncertainty, because the familiar structure of Sebastian as problem or solution no longer applied cleanly. The vote ultimately failed again, but this time the failure did not consolidate opposition into victory, it fragmented it. Because some board members began to see his restructuring not as decline but as a different model of leadership, one that redistributed control rather than concentrated it. After the meeting, Sebastian did not return to immediate analysis or follow-up calls, instead going directly back to the estate earlier than expected, and when he arrived, Bella ran to him without hesitation but this time did not cling or seek reassurance, instead showing him a drawing she had made of a house with many open doors, and when he asked what it meant she said simply that doors were for going in and out, not for locking people inside, a sentence that struck him with more clarity than any executive report had that day. Over the following days, Sebastian made a choice that altered his corporate identity more permanently. He publicly announced a phased reduction in aggressive expansion policies and introduced a governance model centered on continuity stewardship, a term that analysts struggled to categorized but which effectively redefined his company's trajectory away from hostile acquisition cycles, and while shareholders reacted with mixed volatility, the market response stabilized faster than predicted because the underlying assets remained strong, even if ambition had been deliberately constrained. At the estate, this external shift translated into something more personal, because Sebastian's presence became more consistent, not in duration but in attention, as if he had stopped dividing himself between roles and began existing as one continuous state of participation. Irene, noticing this, began to test the stability in subtle ways, not out of distrust but to understand whether it would hold under pressure, sometimes delaying responses to see if he would revert to old patterns, sometimes introducing uncertainty into plans to observe whether control impulses resurfaced, and what she discovered unsettled her more than instability would have. He no longer defaulted to control as reflex, but instead tolerated ambiguity long enough for solutions to emerge collaboratively. Bella, meanwhile, began initiating joint interactions that were no longer structured around emotional reassurance but shared activity, drawing together, preparing food together, rearranging parts of the garden under Irene's supervision, and in these moments the household no longer resembled a fragile recovery but an evolving system that had found its own adaptive logic. Yet beneath this emerging coherence, there remained one unresolved layer: what this life would become once it was no longer defined by crisis response. And that question surfaced quietly one evening when Bella asked whether people ever get bored when nothing bad is happening, a question that neither adult answered immediately because it revealed a deeper truth, that stability itself required emotional re-education, not just structural change. Sebastian eventually responded by saying that boredom was what people felt when they forgot how to notice small things, and that learning to notice again was part of living differently, while Irene added that not every quiet moment needed to be filled to remain meaningful, a statement that seemed to settle into Bella's understanding in a way that did not require agreement but acceptance. And as the estate settled into another night where no emergencies arrived, Sebastian stood at the window watching the garden lights sway in wind that no longer felt threatening, realizing that for the first time his life was not organized around avoiding collapse or forcing expansion, but around maintaining a shared space where unpredictability did not mean danger. And in that realization there was no dramatic resolution, only the beginning of something that required continuous choice rather than singular decision, and that, more than any victory in court or boardroom, now defined the structure of everything they were building together. The fragile equilibrium they had built did not collapse all at once, but it began to strain in ways that were almost imperceptible at first, like a structure responding to pressure by redistributing it rather than breaking. And Sebastian noticed it in the corporate sphere before it appeared at home, when a coordinated wave of investor withdrawals hit one of his major subsidiaries following a leaked report that misrepresented his continuity stewardship model as concealed insolvency strategy, a distortion engineered with enough precision to trigger uncertainty without being provably defamatory. And for the first time in months he saw clearly that stepping away from aggression had not ended conflict but changed its form into something quieter and more sophisticated. At the estate, Irene recognized the shift not through business updates but through Sebastian's silence, which had changed quality again, not the rigid silence of earlier crisis management, but a focused inward recalibration. That meant he was processing multiple external pressures simultaneously, and she confronted him directly one evening while Bella was occupied in the garden, asking whether the company was destabilizing again or if this was simply a predictable backlash to structural change. And Sebastian admitted it was both, but added something more unsettling: That the opposition now understood he could be pressured through indirect systems, meaning attacks would increasingly target perception, relationships, and emotional continuity rather than balance sheets alone. That realization became real sooner than expected when Bella's school admission process, which had been arranged quietly as part of her reintegration into normal childhood structure, suddenly encountered administrative obstruction due to ongoing guardianship review relevance, a bureaucratic phrase that masked external interference from parties seeking to reopen her stability assessment. And when Irene brought the notice to Sebastian, his reaction was immediate but controlled, not explosive, but sharply focused in a way that indicated he now recognized the pattern. Anything connected to him that could not be bought or controlled directly would be destabilized indirectly through the people closest to him. Instead of responding through legal escalation, however, he made a different choice, one that surprised even Irene. He stepped back from direct confrontation and delegated legal response entirely to a newly formed independent counsel team, explicitly removing himself as named actor in proceedings to reduce leverage points, a move that frustrated his remaining traditional allies but reduced immediate pressure on Bella's situation. Meanwhile, Bella began sensing tension again, not through explicit events but through emotional temperature changes in the house, and her behavior shifted into cautious observation, staying closer to Irene during mornings and asking fewer spontaneous questions, as if recalibrating her own sense of safety based on adult unpredictability. Irene, in turn, began experiencing something she had not anticipated: protective vigilance that was no longer reactive but anticipatory, and it manifested not in fear but in structured awareness, such as tracking media narratives more carefully and noticing patterns in how Sebastian was being described externally versus how he functioned internally, and the divergence between those narratives began to feel like its own form of conflict. Then, unexpectedly, a new figure entered the dynamic, not through confrontation but through proximity, a senior mediator appointed by a consortium of shareholders seeking resolution before total destabilization, a woman named Dr. Helen Arkwright, whose presence at the estate was framed as advisory but functioned as diagnostic, and she observed the household not with judgment but with unsettling precision, noting patterns of interaction, response timing, and emotional co-regulation between Sebastian, Irene, and Bella, and within 2 days she articulated something that none of them had explicitly verbalized: that their current system was stable only because it was interdependent, not because any individual within it was fully stabilized alone. Sebastian initially resisted this framing, interpreting it as reduction of agency, but Irene countered unexpectedly by agreeing with the structural observation while rejecting its implication of fragility, arguing instead that interdependence was not weakness but architecture. And Bella, overhearing fragments of this discussion, quietly asked whether that meant they would still stay together even if people outside disagreed, a question that forced all adults into silence longer than usual because it required them to confront not internal dynamics but external legitimacy. At the corporate level, the pressure intensified when a rival alliance attempted a partial hostile acquisition not of Sebastian's main company, but of a critical infrastructure subsidiary responsible for logistical control systems, a move designed to bypass his core defenses and destabilize operational continuity indirectly. And for the first time, Sebastian authorized a defensive response that was not centered on expansion or retaliation but on structural isolation, separating the targeted subsidiary into an autonomous trust governed by independent oversight, effectively making it unattractive to acquisition while preserving its function, a decision that angered some shareholders but neutralized the attack with minimal confrontation. At home, however, the emotional cost of sustained pressure began to surface in subtler ways, as Bella experienced a brief regression episode after a particularly intense media cycle that reintroduced public speculation about unstable guardianship environments, and during that evening she withdrew into silence for several hours, refusing even Irene's presence initially, not out of rejection but overload, and Irene responded not by pushing interaction but by maintaining proximity without demand, sitting outside Bella's room until the child eventually opened the door slightly and allowed her to sit nearby without speaking, an interaction that Sebastian observed later with visible restraint because he recognized it as a pattern of support he had never learned to enact naturally. Afterward, he asked Irene how she knew when to intervene and when to wait, and she answered that she did not always know, but had learned that forcing resolution too early often created longer instability cycles, a principle that Sebastian accepted not intellectually alone but behaviorally in subsequent decisions. Dr. Arkwright's final assessment, delivered days later, was neither endorsement nor warning but classification. The household functioned as a high-cohesion adaptive system under external pressure, with primary risk not internal dysfunction but external destabilization attempts targeting attachment points, and her recommendation was not separation but reinforcement of boundary integrity around the system rather than within it. That language reframed everything for Sebastian, because it translated emotional life into structural terms without reducing its meaning, and for the first time he began to see that what they were building was not a fragile exception to instability but a different category of stability entirely. Shortly after, Irene's ex-husband attempted one final procedural escalation by submitting a revised custody-related complaint incorporating selectively edited public footage, but this time it was dismissed rapidly due to lack of evidentiary coherence, and the dismissal felt less like victory and more like exhaustion of an adversarial strategy. In the aftermath, life did not return to calm so much as settle into a new baseline where pressure still existed but no longer dictated rhythm, and Bella began attending school with gradual normalization. Sometimes reluctant in the mornings but consistently returning with small, increasingly confident stories about interactions with other children, and each of these accounts added another layer of stability to her internal sense of continuity. Sebastian, meanwhile, made a final internal shift that was not announced externally. He stepped down from active executive leadership of his conglomerate, retaining ownership but delegating operational authority to a structured council with independent governance, a move that effectively ended his identity as singular decision-maker and replaced it with oversight participation. And though analysts debated the implications, within the estate the change manifested simply as increased presence rather than absence, because he was now physically and emotionally available without the fragmentation that had once defined him. On the evening after that transition became public, the three of them stood together in the garden without speaking for a long time, not because there was nothing to say but because speaking was no longer required to confirm continuity, and Bella eventually leaned against both of them at once in a casual, unplanned gesture that did not signal need or fear but belonging, and Sebastian realized then that nothing in his previous life had ever taught him how to recognize stability that did not depend on control, while Irene understood that the life she had entered through collapse had become something she no longer measured against what came before. And as the night settled around them without urgency, there was no final resolution, only the sustained reality of a structure that continued to hold not because it resisted change, but because it had learned how to absorb it without breaking. The change in Sebastian's life did not remain confined to governance structures or corporate diagrams. It began to echo into the quieter corners of his identity in ways that were harder to quantify, and the first person to notice was not his legal team or the board, but Bella, who observed that he no longer answered his phone immediately when it rang, even when the tone suggested urgency, instead finishing whatever moment he was in before deciding whether it required response, a behavior that would have been unthinkable months earlier when every signal of external demand had dictated his reflexes. Irene noticed something different but related. Sebastian had begun to experience pauses without discomfort, moments where he did not immediately fill silence with action or analysis, and those pauses were not emptiness but a kind of recalibration that made him less reactive and more deliberate, though also more difficult to read from the outside. This subtle transformation became more visible when a new development emerged from his corporate sphere, this time